Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to get into the origins of Christmas, but with a bit of a twist. Our source this time is, this booklet called The True Origin of Christmas, and it's by a guy named David C. Pack, and he's a minister in a group called the Restored Church of God. And this group actually splintered off from the Worldwide Church of God, which itself is already pretty far from, what most people think of as like mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. Pack's group holds some beliefs that a lot of Christians would consider unorthodox. And in this booklet, he lays out a very particular view of Christmas. He sees it as deeply rooted in paganism and a direct violation of God's commands.
Okay, so let's unpack that. So he starts by going after the date of Christmas, right? December 25th. He doesn't think that's when Jesus was even born.
Right. Pack argues that December 25th wasn't Christ's actual birthday. He uses Luke 2.8, where it describes shepherds abiding in the fields with their flocks at night. And Pack's point is that shepherds wouldn't have been doing that in December, not in that region because of the cold weather.
So he's using the Bible to challenge a date that most people just accept as fact.
And what's interesting is that he's not the only one who's pointed this out. Even sources like the Catholic Encyclopedia acknowledge that December 25th is probably not the actual date of Jesus's birth.
Oh, really?
But what's important is how Pack uses this. It's like he's setting the stage, getting people to question something they thought they knew for sure.
And then where does he go with it?
He suggests that December 25th was chosen because it lined up with this Roman festival, Saturnalia. They celebrated around the winter solstice.
Saturnalia. Okay, so what was that all about?
Well, according to Pack, Saturnalia was like a week-long party. A time for feasts, gift-giving, decorating homes with greenery. He links it to the worship of Saturn, who was the Roman god of sowing. And get this, Saturn was also seen as a fire god. And what's interesting? Saturday is actually named after Saturn.
Whoa, I never even thought about that. That's wild.
Right, it's like this little hidden piece of history. But for Pack, this connection to Saturn, the fire god, is really central to his argument. And he doesn't just stop there. He goes on to tie Saturn to all these other fire gods from different cultures, like Nimrod, Kronos, Molech, Baal, suggesting they're all just different representations of the same figure.
And this is where he starts getting into some really disturbing stuff. All the stuff about child sacrifice.
Yeah, he cites historical sources like the two Babylons and Paradise Lost to kind of paint this picture of these deities and the horrifying practices associated with their worship, especially child sacrifice. He even tries to connect the word cannibal to the Hebrew word for priest, khan, implying that there was this link between ancient priests of Baal and cannibalism.
Hold on a second. I gotta say, that seems like a stretch. I'm pretty sure that's not where the word cannibal came from. And his whole portrayal of these ancient religions seems pretty one-sided and extreme. I don't think most scholars would agree with his generalizations.
Yeah, you're right to be cautious. While it's true that child sacrifice was practiced in some ancient religions, I think Pack's interpretation of history and language here is definitely questionable. He's building a case, for sure, and he's using some very strong language to demonize these ancient practices, to make them seem as evil as possible.
So how does he tie all of this back to Christmas?
Well, he argues that a lot of our modern Christmas traditions are basically just echoes of these ancient pagan rituals. He points to the Christmas tree, saying it's a direct parallel to the tradition of offerings under decorated evergreen trees during Saturnalia. He even suggests that the little figurines people hang on their trees, the Oscilla, he says those are relics of human sacrifice.
Wait, what? That's crazy. You're saying like those little Santa ornaments are somehow connected to human sacrifice? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's a very controversial interpretation, to say the least. While trees and decorations definitely have ancient roots, most scholars don't agree that they're directly connected to human sacrifice. It seems like Pack is using selective evidence and interpreting it in a way that fits his narrative.
So he's basically cherry-picking information to demonize Christmas.
Yeah.
What else does he target?
Well, next he goes after Santa Claus.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. What does Santa Claus have to do with ancient paganism?
He tries to link Santa to St. Nicholas and then to Nimrod, that fire god figure we were talking about earlier. He suggests that St. Nicholas was actually a common name for Nimrod in Asia Minor.
So he's trying to fit everything into this fire god narrative.
Yeah, and he takes it even further. He brings up the doctrine of the Nicolaitans from the book of Revelation, which Christ condemns, and connects it to the name Nicholas, which means conqueror, destroyer. It's like he's building this case that even the name Santa is inherently evil.
But isn't that a huge jump? I mean, most scholars interpret the doctrine of the Nicolaitans very differently. It refers to a specific early Christian sect, not some broad concept of destruction like Pack is implying.
You're absolutely right. And this is a good example of where we see Pack deviating from traditional Christian beliefs. He's taking biblical passages out of context and twisting their meaning to fit his own agenda. It's important to remember that mainstream Christianity doesn't view Santa Claus, or the name Nicholas, as inherently evil.
So he's basically creating this elaborate conspiracy theory, drawing connections where they don't exist.
That's one way to put it. He's using selective evidence, questionable interpretations, and inflammatory language to make Christmas seem like this sinister pagan plot.
What about gift giving? Surely he can't connect that to paganism, can he?
Oh, he tries. He argues that the whole idea of Christmas gift-giving being based on the wise men bringing gifts to Jesus is a distortion. He emphasizes that the wise men gave gifts directly to Jesus. They didn't give gifts to each other, and that this was a custom when you were appearing before a king, not a birthday tradition. And then he goes on to criticize the commercialization of Christmas, saying that it's become more about receiving than giving.
So he's basically saying that our modern way of exchanging gifts is selfish and materialistic,
Oh.
and that it's a far cry from the true spirit of Christianity.
Exactly. He's trying to paint Christmas as this materialistic, self-serving holiday that has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus.
It's interesting. He's appealing to Christian values while simultaneously condemning a holiday that a lot of Christians hold dear.
It's a tactic you see a lot with groups like TACS. They present themselves as the true Christians, the only ones who understand God's will, while everyone else is misled and on the path to damnation.
It's pretty divisive and judgmental.
It is, and it's important to be aware of this kind of rhetoric, because it can be very manipulative and harmful.
So this has been a really eye-opening deep dive so far. It's amazing how much history and controversy is packed into a holiday that most people just associate with, you know, presents and family gatherings.
Right. It really makes you wonder, where do our traditions come from, and what do they really mean?
Yeah. And are we just blindly following customs without understanding their origins or significance?
That's a great question, and that's where this deep dive gets really fascinating.
I can't wait to keep going.
Me too.
You know, before we got into all of this, I gotta say, I never really thought twice about Christmas trees or Santa Claus. But now, well, now I'm starting to see them in a whole new light.
It's funny how that happens, right? Even if you don't agree with everything he's saying, Pack's booklet definitely makes you question things you might have taken for granted.
Totally. And you mentioned earlier that he actually contradicts traditional Christian teachings. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of the biggest examples is his claim that celebrating Christmas is a form of idolatry and an abomination in the eyes of God. This is a pretty extreme view, and most Christians would definitely disagree with it.
So what do most Christians believe about Christmas?
In mainstream Christianity, Christmas is seen as a celebration of the incarnation, the belief that God became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. It's a time to reflect on God's love for humanity and the gift of salvation through Jesus.
So the focus is on the theological significance of the event, not so much on the historical accuracy of the date or the origins of specific traditions.
Exactly. A lot of Christian theologians acknowledge that some Christmas customs may have pre-Christian roots, but they say that doesn't take away from the spiritual meaning of the holiday.
So you're saying they believe these traditions have been Christianized over time?
Exactly. They see them as symbolic expressions of Christian beliefs and values, even if they didn't originally come from a Christian context. Like, take the Christmas tree, for example. Pack says it's a pagan symbol, and he even quotes Jeremiah 10, where God condemns the practice of decorating trees.
But I've always seen the Christmas tree as a symbol of everlasting life. You know, like a representation of Christ as the tree of life.
And that's the view that most Christians hold. It really highlights how important context and interpretation are. When we're talking about religious symbols and practices, it's not always about the literal object itself, it's about the meaning we give to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So from a traditional Christian perspective, celebrating Christmas isn't seen as disobeying God's commands like Pack says it is. It's more about honoring Christ and celebrating the core beliefs of the Christian faith.
You got it. Now let's go back to another one of Pack's more controversial claims. You know the whole thing about Santa Claus being linked to Nimrod, that ancient fire god? He even suggests that parents who keep the Santa Claus myth alive are basically, well, sacrificing their children to this pagan deity.
Okay, wow. That's a pretty disturbing accusation.
It is. So let's look at what other sources say about where Santa Claus came from. The figure of Santa Claus does have a long and complex history. But the most common origin story traces him back to St. Nicholas. He was a 4th century Christian bishop, known for his generosity, especially toward children.
So the connection to a benevolent Christian figure is pretty well established.
It is. And while some parts of the modern Santa Claus myth might have been influenced by folklore or commercialism, like his association with the North Pole and flying reindeer, the heart of the tradition comes from a Christian figure.
So Pack's whole theory about Santa being connected to Nimrod and child sacrifice seems pretty far-fetched.
It does. He's picking and choosing pieces of history and mythology to fit this narrative that he already has in his mind, that Christmas is inherently pagan.
And that seems to be what he does throughout the whole booklet. He picks and chooses what he wants from historical sources and biblical passages, and then he presents his interpretations as if they're facts, when they're really just his own opinions.
Right, and this is why it's so important to think critically, especially when you're reading something that has strong bias. We need to be aware of what the author's agenda might be, and think about other perspectives.
It's like that saying, consider the source.
Exactly. It's also a good reminder to check out a variety of sources, and not just take one person's word for it, especially when you're looking at complicated topics like religion and history.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another point that Peck really emphasizes, the whole concept of syncretism. You know, the blending of pagan customs with Christian worship. He sees this as a major sin, and he uses it as a reason to condemn celebrating Christmas.
So he's saying that any mixing of paganism with Christianity is unacceptable.
Right. But his argument is based on this idea that there's this clear dividing line between Christian practices and pagan practices. But if you look at history, it's much more complicated than that.
So you're saying there's been a lot of interaction and exchange between different cultures and religious traditions throughout history.
Absolutely. And early Christianity was no different as it spread throughout the Roman Empire. It naturally took on certain elements of the culture that was already there, and some of those elements might have had pagan roots.
So does that mean that Christianity is somehow invalid? Or that those practices are inherently wrong?
That's a really tough question to answer, and it's something that theologians have been debating for centuries. Some Christians, like Pack, have a very rigid view, and they believe that any mixing of paganism with Christianity is a corruption of the faith.
But there are other interpretations, right?
Of course. A lot of Christians see Christianity as a missionary faith that's supposed to spread and adapt to different cultures. They point to the Apostle Paul, who told Christians to be all things to all people in order to share the gospel.
So from that perspective, adopting certain cultural practices, even those with pagan origins, could be seen as a way to make the Christian faith more relatable and accessible to people from different backgrounds.
Right. It's about recognizing that religious traditions are fluid and adaptable. They change over time, and they interact with the world around them.
It seems like Pack's booklet doesn't really acknowledge that nuance. He presents this very strict and inflexible view of Christianity.
Exactly. And we have to remember that his perspective is coming from his background in Armstrongism, which is a relatively recent offshoot of Christianity, with its own set of beliefs and practices that many consider to be outside of what's considered Orthodox Christianity.
It's like he's looking at Christmas through a very specific lens that distorts the bigger picture.
That's a great way to put it. So we've explored some of Pack's key arguments against Christmas, but we've also seen that there are other perspectives to consider. So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is, well, history and religion are complex, and there aren't always easy answers.
You got it. We need to be careful and approach these topics with an open mind. Consider different viewpoints, and be aware of any biases that might be shaping the information we're given.
And especially when it comes to Christmas, it seems like there's a lot more to the story than what we see on the surface.
Definitely, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It's been really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, me too.
You know, it's funny, we've been looking at this booklet that basically says Christmas is this pagan conspiracy. But I gotta say, I'm still feeling pretty festive.
I know what you mean. It's interesting how even when you hear arguments that challenge your beliefs, the power of tradition and personal experience can be really strong.
Yeah. And I'm starting to think that maybe the true meaning of Christmas, well, it's not really about historical accuracy or the origins of traditions. Maybe it's about something more personal. You know, something that means something to each individual.
That's a great point. And that's really what makes Christmas such a complex and fascinating topic. It's not just a holiday. It's a reflection of our own beliefs and values and cultural experiences.
Yeah, like Christmas is a mirror.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into David Pack's view of Christmas, I want to go back to something he said that really stood out to me. He uses that quote from Matthew, "You shall know them by their fruits," to condemn Christmas.
Right. He's saying that the fruits of Christmas are all negative.
Exactly. He points to things like commercialism and materialism, family conflicts, even things like increased rates of adultery and drunk driving, as evidence that Christmas has a bad influence.
But couldn't you also argue that Christmas brings people together? That it inspires people to be more generous and kind? I mean, think about all the toy drives and food banks that get so much support around Christmas time.
You absolutely could. And I think a lot of people would say that those are the true fruits of Christmas. A spirit of giving and compassion and togetherness.
So it seems like the fruits of Christmas are open to interpretation, just like the holiday itself.
Exactly. It all depends on what you choose to focus on. It's about perspective. And deciding what resonates with you personally, it's also about recognizing that everyone has a different experience. What might be negative for one person could be positive for another.
I think that's a great point.
So where does this all leave us? What's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important thing is to question everything. Explore different ideas and be open to different viewpoints. Don't just accept things at face value. Dig a little deeper, do your own research, and then come to your own conclusions.
That's such good advice.
And don't be afraid to challenge ideas,
Yeah.
even if they're coming from someone you see as an authority figure, or if they're part of a tradition you've always followed. It's through that process of critical thinking and respectful dialogue that we learn and grow and really deepen our understanding.
Well said. And remember, traditions like Christmas are always changing. They adapt and absorb new influences, and their meanings change over time. It's a good reminder that culture is constantly evolving.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes,
Yeah.
to how complex something I thought I knew really is.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right?
Exactly.
You never know what you might find.
So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep diving deeper, keep exploring, and keep asking those tough questions.
You got it.
That's what the deep dive is all about. We'll see you next time.